Hello everyone, a very good morning and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to the daily Hindu News Analysis. Before we begin today's discussion, we have an important announcement. After having delivered stellar results year after year, we have decided to provide a free trial access to all our classes on the BYJU'S Exam Prep app. This will be available for 3 days. You will have complete access to all the classes, the live classes, the recorded lectures. You can even take subject-based quiz on the BYJU'S Exam Prep app. All you have to do is click on the link that has been provided in the pinned comment and register yourself so that you get access to the free trial, which is available for 3 complete days. This is a program, a campaign which keeps running regularly, and the moment you register, you will get access for 3 days to all the classes and lectures available on the BYJU'S Exam Prep app. So we hope you make the full use of this and try and cover all important topics by making use of the free classes that are being provided. With this, let's begin with the discussion of today's The Hindu newspaper. Let's take a look at the topics we are going to discuss today. I have chosen a few important articles from page 8, 12 and few other pages which are more relevant for the mains exam, and I have chosen a few articles that are more relevant for the prelims. So let's discuss all the articles comprehensively and let's try to understand each article one by one. We shall begin with this column which is found in the editorial page of today's The Hindu newspaper. This column, written by Aniket Aga, deals with genetically modified crops, specifically GM mustard. The writer is talking about the current case which is ongoing at the Supreme Court of India regarding the release of GM mustard, which has been developed by the Delhi University, and the government has already granted necessary approvals for testing this variant of GM mustard in the field to conduct field trials. But environmental activists have opposed the release of GM food crops on various grounds, and they have filed this case at the Supreme Court, and the case is currently ongoing. The center is completely supporting the rollout and introduction of GM food crops, at least on a trial basis, but activists are opposing the introduction. So this topic of genetically modified crops, especially food crops, is always a highly debatable and contentious topic, not just in India but around the world. So let's look at this in complete detail. Let's understand what is this specific issue all about, what is GM mustard, what is this new variant which has been developed by a research team at the Delhi University. We will talk about genetic engineering and genetically modified crops. We'll discuss the pros and cons, the regulatory mechanisms in India, and finally we'll discuss the writer's viewpoint as well. According to the article, the GM mustard variant which is being referred to, it was recently brought out in October 2022 by the Delhi University, which has developed the DMH11 variant of mustard. Mustard, as you know, is a key ingredient in Indian cuisine, and it's a key food crop as well. So Dara mustard hybrid, or DMH11, it's a genetically modified transgenic crop. A specific gene has been introduced to make this mustard herbicide tolerant. It has been genetically modified to make it herbicide tolerant so that farmers can spray herbicide all across the agricultural farm to kill all the weeds and other unnecessary plants, whereas the GM mustard plant will not be affected by the herbicide. They need not selectively apply the herbicide. The advantage for farmers is that if you are growing herbicide tolerant crops, you can spray the herbicide uniformly across the field. All the other plants and weeds will get eliminated except for the herbicide tolerant plants. So this is the desired feature which is added through genetic engineering in the case of herbicide tolerant crops. So this variant of mustard, the DMH11 variant, which was recently developed by the Delhi University, this is herbicide tolerant, and the government through the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee has granted the initial approval for a field trial to be conducted. Before rolling it out for the farmers and the public, the GEAC, the regulatory body, has given the initial approval for a field trial to check the environmental impact and other consequences of the introduction of GM food crops in the country. As of now, there is no GM food crop introduced in India. The only GM crop to have been rolled out on a commercial scale is BT cotton. As you know, cotton is a non-food crop. So the only GM variant that India has released for commercial usage is BT cotton, which is a non-food crop. So GM mustard might become the first food crop to be released commercially. So the government is taking the necessary steps given the benefits that arise from genetically engineered crops. But along with the benefits, there are many concerns related to genetically modified crops. That is why there is very strong political and environmental opposition with regard to the rollout of GM food crops in the country. Now, if you look at this variant of GM mustard, the DMH11, this includes two alien transgenic genes which have been introduced from a soil bacterium known as Bacillus amyloliquefaciens. From this bacteria, two transgenic genes have been taken, the Barnase and Bastar. They have been isolated and added to the gene structure of the mustard. So this is the modification which has been done. Similarly, how BT cotton had been modified. BT stands for Bacillothuringenesis, which is a soil bacterium from which a desired genetic materials was taken and introduced into the genetic structure of the cotton seed. So this was called BT cotton, which has been rolled out commercially in India. Today, farmers across the country, they do grow genetically modified cotton. But when it comes to food crops, there are very serious concerns for human health, for the environment. There are ethical, socio-economic concerns as well associated with genetic engineering and genetic modification. So before we look at what the writer is talking about, let's understand what are genetically modified crops. Let's discuss the pros and cons. Let's talk about the regulatory measures in India so that you have a complete understanding, and then we can take a look at the article. GM crops are essentially those crops which are genetically modified, right? They are artificially modified in a lab through genetic engineering, where desired genes are introduced, usually from other organisms, such as a soil bacteria. Desired features are introduced into a crop. For example, a certain crop could be made disease resistant. It could be made pest resistant or tolerant to herbicides, or it could be made drought resistant so that it can consume less water and still provide high productivity. Crops can be engineered for better attractiveness, where fruits and vegetables look more attractive to the consumer, right? Imagine if fruits and vegetables have a bigger size and a longer shelf life, if they appear more colorful, right? So from a consumer point of view, crops can be modified, and also with regard to productivity, and also with regard to challenges faced by farmers like pests, then insects, etc. These are challenges for farming. So keeping all those concerns in mind, crops can be genetically modified by inserting these transgenic genes, which are drawn from another organism. So genetic engineering does offer a lot of benefits. The ability to come up with engineered crops is definitely desirable, especially in the interest of food security. Given the rising population of the world and challenges in agriculture and the impact of climate change and global warming, there is always a concern about drop in food productivity, which could create hunger, malnutrition, and even trigger wars and conflicts. So genetically modified crops are seen as a solution to strengthen global food security. to tackle hunger, malnutrition, and also to support economies and to support farmers. Because GM crops, they do provide a lot of benefits. According to those who support GM crops, according to the proponents, through such genetic modification, plant crops, they can be modified for attractiveness to make them more appealing to the consumer. As I told you, fruits and vegetables, they can be made more attractive with regard to their appearance, even texture, taste, flavor, all of this can be altered. Longer shelf life could also help in reducing wastage, along with making it more appealing to the consumer. Right? If a fruit or vegetable has a longer shelf life, you tend to buy those crops, those produce, as you can preserve that for a longer time. With enhanced flavor, texture and taste, right? You can push the consumers to buy certain crops which could benefit the farmers as well and help farmers increase their income. It could help the overall economy as well. So GM crops definitely can benefit the rural economy, the farmers, and the agrarian economy in general. It can benefit the food processing industries. These crops can be designed to be resistant to certain diseases. Through genetic modification, they can be made more resilient against certain viruses, bacteria, and other pathogens. They could be made pest tolerant and insect tolerant. They could be made herbicide tolerant, where farmers can freely spray the herbicides to remove all the other weeds and plants except for the primary crop. The nutritional value also can be enhanced. For example, you have golden rice, you also have certain GM corn variants which are rolled out in US and other countries where the nutritional value has been enhanced through genetic modification. In fact, there are few countries where GM food crops are already available in the market. Is that clear? US is one example where a number of GM crops, food crops are available for consumption by the people. So the ability to design such plants and crops which are even drought resistant, heat resistant, which don't require a lot of water to grow, which are less water intensive, plants which can thrive even in saline conditions, right? This is a blessing for the farmers and the rural community. Definitely, these are the potential advantages that arise out of introduction of GM crops. Along with these advantages, there are many risk factors as well. There are many serious concerns associated with the rollout of genetically modified crops. The biggest risk is about biosafety. Biosafety risks with regard to human health and also with regard to the environment. Critics of genetic engineering, they point out that the effects of genetically engineered crops and the impact is not well studied and understood in the long term. There isn't enough research available to prove the long-term benefits or to highlight the long-term side effects and impact on human health and the environment. There's a lot of speculation here, even though the fears have not been entirely proven conclusively. But there have been concerns raised by several scientists, researchers, and even by environmental activists that GM crops could pose a threat to human health. There are fears about possible allergic reactions. There are fears about certain genetic modifications being carcinogenic to humans. There are concerns that it could lead to antimicrobial resistance and build up antibacterial resistance. It could potentially alter human DNA as well as the genetically modified gene structures enter the human gut and eventually the bloodstream. There are concerns raised with regard to modification, long-term modification of the human DNA itself or toxicity to certain human organs like liver, kidney, etc. All of these are unproven entirely, but there is an allegation, there is some prima facie evidence to indicate that there could be potentially a biosafety risk for human health. Similarly, there could be potential biosafety risks for the environment as well. If we do not study the impact of GM crops in the long term, and roll them out prematurely, this could lead to irreversible damage to our environment and biodiversity. There are concerns that the introduction of herbicide-tolerant, pest-resistant, insect-resistant crops, it could further lead to the spread of weeds, pests and insects. It could pollute the gene pools of endangered plant species, and it could push all organisms also to adapt, mutate and evolve. Insects, microorganisms, they might start evolving. Other plants, especially weeds and other unnecessary plants which harm agricultural crops, they might start adapting and mutating and evolving, leading to complete changes in biodiversity and ecosystems. It could give rise to more invasive species and erode biodiversity, impacting even the animal world. It's not just the plant kingdom which could face the impact, but the whole ecosystem in general could be affected, leading to evolution of new insects, alteration in food chains, impact on animal health. So all these are some serious biosafety concerns that have been expressed. Along with this, there is also the possibility of a socio-economic impact on the consumer and the farmer. See, consuming GM food crop should be an informed choice for the consumer. Given the risks associated with it, the consumer should know that they are consuming genetically modified food crops. That's why GMO labeling has been brought out in countries where GM foods are available. This could potentially impact consumer choice and consumer health. Consumer choice and consumer health, and even the price that we are paying for food commodities could face an adverse impact in the long run. We don't know the exact consequences, how it's going to impact the broader economy and how it will alter consumer choices. The bigger concern is about the farmers, because these genetically modified seeds can only be produced by large multinational corporations. These companies will be driven by the profit motive. So seed companies, biotech companies, they will mint money, and the increase in prices could affect the farmers and thereby destabilize agriculture and threaten the rural economy itself. Any adverse effect will be borne by the farmers and the agrarian community. So there are serious socio-economic concerns expressed as well with regard to GMO crops. Then finally, there are ethical concerns as well, which you need to acknowledge and appreciate. Because through genetic engineering, we humans are essentially playing God. We are altering the natural genetic structures, engineering them to suit our needs and requirements. That too without understanding the broad long-term consequences on the environment and human health. So this is also about making the right ethical choice. Just like there are concerns with artificial intelligence, just like there are concerns with stem cell research, just like there are concerns about CRISPR-Cas9 editing, right? Similarly, there are ethical concerns associated with GM crops as well, because the consumer should have the choice. Tomorrow, if governments and multinational corporations are forcing GM crops and consumer never has the choice, then that is a unethical choice that the consumer is being pushed to make. So there are serious ethical concerns that come up with regard to genetic engineering as well. So these are the concerns brought up by environmental activists and several political groups and even by researchers and experts as well. So there are two sides to the argument. Now, if you look at India, where does India stand with regard to genetic engineering, with regard to non-food crops and food crops? India does have a very strict regulatory mechanism in place. We also have an apex regulator, which is the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee, or the GEAC, which is a statutory body. All right, please make a note. This is very, very important even for your prelims. The GEAC is the apex body for approving any release of GM crops in the country, be it for testing, field trials, or final commercial rollout. For both food crops and non-food crops, it's the GEAC, which is the nodal body. It is established under the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change under the provisions of the Environment Protection Act. Environment Protection Act 1986. It deals with biosafety concerns. It deals with the concerns related to genetic modification. So under these provisions, the GEAC has been set up as a statutory body under the Environment Ministry, and the current name was given in 2010. It was previously called Genetic Engineering Approval Committee. Now it's been renamed as Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee. This committee has representation not just from the government, but also from the academia, experts, and from civil society. So GEAC has the powers to regulate the rollout of GM crops in India, be it the development of GM crops, their storage, usage, because it's essentially a biohazard. It is treated as a biohazard. The handling of the hazardous substances, even their import, export, their storage, everything is completely regulated by the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee. So under the Environment Protection Act and also under a few other rules and regulations, we have a strict regulatory mechanism in place. In India, the GM debate has been quite contentious. Over the last 20 to 25 years, there has been a very strong contentious debate going on in the country. There are proponents and there are critics and opponents as well. So the country has seen a robust debate with regard to the introduction of GM crops on the grounds of its environmental safety, safety with regard to human health, its efficacy and the claimed benefits, and even with regard to the socio-economic impact and the ethical concerns. On all these grounds, sufficient debate has already taken place in the country. In the parliament, in the civil society, in the media, within the government, there has been sufficient debate, and till date, we haven't reached a final conclusion. The only GM crop to be rolled out in India is BT cotton, which is a non-food crop. GM food crops have not been rolled out for commercial usage. So GM mustard, the DMH11 variant, it's only been approved for a field trial to test out the impact. So that is why there is that strong opposition, and environmental activists have approached the court, the Supreme Court, against the decision of the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee. Now, if you look at India's experience with BT cotton, which is the only GM crop to have been rolled out in India, data shows that the claimed benefits have not actually been realized by the farmers or by the economy. The makers of BT cotton, these seed manufacturing companies, they claim that the crop will have tremendous benefits, it will increase productivity, it is pest resistant, right? But on the ground, these benefits have not been exactly proven according to the writer. Writer says there is enough data available to show through long-term research that the purported claims of GM crops is not entirely true. In fact, there are many side effects associated with it as well. He challenges the claims made by these companies, and he points out that farmers have not really benefited through BT cotton. The purported benefits have not been realized, the productivity has not really gone up exponentially, farmer income has not gone up. Even the other claims regarding the crop being pest resistant and other positive features of the crop have not been fully realized, whereas the cost of cultivation and the risk has increased for the farmer. Now that farmers are dependent on these seed companies, most of the companies are establishing their monopolies in the market. It has limited the other native variants. They have been almost pushed towards eradication, the native plant variants. And as farmers are forced to depend on the GM variants, they have to purchase these seeds at higher prices from the seed manufacturers. So this has increased the profits for these companies while putting the economic burden on the farmer. The input cost has gone up with very limited provable benefits in the long term. So this being the case, what is the valid basis to roll out other GM crops? That is the question the writer is asking. He also points out the debates that have taken place within the parliament. With regard to GM crops, there have been two important standing committees in the parliament. We had a standing committee on agriculture set up in 2012 under the then Manmohan Singh government. And recently we had a standing committee on science and technology and environment and forests in 2017 under the Modi government. Both these committees have looked into the pros and cons of GM crops, and both the committees have unanimously highlighted the risks associated with GM crops. They have urged extreme caution to be exercised by the government while rolling out GM crops, especially GM food crops in the country, given its health risk, environmental risk, and the socio-economic impact. In fact, the second committee on science and technology and environment and forests, it specifically pointed to the GM mustard variant, which now the Delhi University has developed, and highlighted the various risk factors and asked the government to get it thoroughly assessed through an independent, transparent verification process before giving the necessary regulatory approvals. The committee has urged to keep in mind the biosafety risks, the environmental risks, and the socio-economic and ethical concerns. But according to the writer, the herbicide-tolerant crops are completely unsustainable, as pointed out by these parliamentary standing committees. The second committee in particular, which dealt with GM mustard, pointed out that such genetically modified food crops are seen to be unsustainable in the Indian context, be it with regard to Indian farmers, India's agrarian setup, and also with regard to the environment and ethical choices. These parliamentary committees were of the opinion that genetically modified crops are not sustainable for Indian agriculture. It could have undesirable consequences, negative consequences on the economy and on health and environment as well. So they urge the government to exercise maximum caution before rolling out these crops. So by using this as a supporting argument, the writer is completely against the rollout of GM mustard. Alright, this is the writer's viewpoint. Now you need not take a one-sided opinion. This is one side of the argument. So to balance it out, I've given you the other side of the argument, highlighting the pros, the advantages of such GM crops. It could increase productivity, especially the GM mustard variant. It is herbicide tolerant. It will be easier for farmers to spray herbicides to remove all weeds and unnecessary plants, thereby promote the growth of the GM mustard crop. Right? It could increase farmers' income, increase productivity, could be good for the economy in the long run. Those are the advantages. That is what the government is also looking at. That's the reason why the GEAC has given the primary approvals for a field trial to be conducted. But the writer is completely against it. He's saying that there is overwhelming consensus amongst political parties, experts, and environmental activists that when it comes to GM crops, precaution should be the norm. But according to the writer, the government is ignoring all the warnings. It is disregarding even science and law and the constitutional provisions as well, and going ahead by supporting the rollout of GM mustard. He says that the central government is misleading the Supreme Court in the ongoing case. He says that the government is not presenting enough data to prove the efficacy of these crops. With regard to BT cotton and even with regard to GM mustard, the trial data, the initial data has not been placed in the public domain. Even under RTI Act, information has been denied to the public and the activists. So without informing the public, without bringing out adequate information transparently, the government is seen to be misleading the Supreme Court, thus violating the constitutional and environmental obligations of the government. That is what the writer is pointing out. Even under the Indian Constitution, you have a directive principle which directs the government to protect the environment. Correct? So please find out which article is that. Which article under DPSP mandates the state, pushes the state to focus on environment protection. The writer is saying the government is ignoring the constitutional norms, the legal regulatory provisions, and even scientific evidence, and it is simply pushing ahead by keeping in mind the purported claimed economic benefits. That is what the writer is arguing. But I would strongly urge you to develop a balanced stand. Given the controversial nature of the topic, It's always good to look at both sides of the argument, the pros and cons, and then after providing the supporting arguments, then you can take your stand, your personal opinion can be brought out, right? So this is about the first article, the very important article in today's newspaper. Apart from this, every other article is actually pretty small, but we'll go through them one by one. And also please note, in today's newspaper, there are many more articles related to India-France relations, India-UAE relations, and also to the Enforcement Directorate. I'm not picking those articles today because we have already covered them recently. In the last few days itself, we have had a detailed discussion on India-France, India-UAE, and Enforcement Directorate. So please go back and watch the previous sessions and read those articles in the newspaper. You can just revise that once. All right. Now moving on to the next article from page 12. It's related to Sri Lanka. According to the article, the Tamil National Alliance, the TNA, which is a major Tamil political party in Sri Lanka, which also governs provincial councils in northern and eastern Sri Lanka, this Tamil political party has rejected the devolution offer that was made by the Sri Lankan government headed by Ranil Wickremesinghe. Sri Lankan President Ranil Wickremesinghe has made an offer to Tamil parties in northern and eastern Sri Lanka regarding devolution of powers as per the provisions that were promised under the 13th Amendment, which is linked to the Indo-Sri Lanka Peace Accord of 1987. The Sri Lankan government has proposed to devolve additional powers, especially with regard to the subject of land. But with regard to police, the government has not shown the willingness to devolve the powers to provincial councils, which are autonomous councils. And hence the TNA has rejected the offer made by the Sri Lankan government. That is the development reported in the article. Alright? I want you to know that India has always been a strong supporter of the full implementation of 13th Amendment, which was promised by Sri Lanka under the India-Sri Lanka Peace Accord. I am sure many beginners will be confused right now. Don't worry, I will help you understand this in detail. Now that we know what the article is referring to, let's take a look at this topic in slight detail. Now you're looking at the map of Sri Lanka. It's representing the ethnic profile and the ethnic divisions in Sri Lanka. I hope you know that Sri Lanka has witnessed a very violent and brutal ethnic conflict, right? It's gone through a very brutal history. And this is primarily a result of the ethnic divide between the Sinhala Buddhist majority and the Tamil minorities. If you look at Sri Lanka's map, this is where you find the Sinhala Buddhist majority. These areas that are shaded in purple, that's where you find the majority community, the Sinhala Buddhist majority. Sinhalese refers to the ethnic group, right? They speak the Sinhalese language, and most of the Sinhalese are Buddhists. So it's an ethno-religious identity. The ethnic identity which is dominant in Sri Lanka is the Sinhalese identity, linked with the Sinhalese language and culture. And most of the Sinhalese, majority of them are Buddhists. So it's an ethno-religious identity. Coming to the minorities in the country, the Tamils are in minority. They are found primarily in northern and eastern Sri Lanka over here. This is where you find the Tamil community, also referred to as Sri Lankan Tamils. Tamils found in northern and eastern Sri Lanka are referred to as Sri Lankan Tamils because they came to Sri Lanka many centuries ago through natural migration from southern parts of India towards this part of Sri Lanka. Obviously, prior to colonial times, all of this was part of one civilization, right? You didn't have these boundaries, these territorial boundaries that existed. So from southern parts of India, from the regions of today's Tamil Nadu, there has been natural migration towards Sri Lanka, and Tamil community has settled in northern and eastern provinces from centuries. And they actually had a good relationship with the majority Sinhala Buddhists. So this category of Tamils found in northern and eastern provinces who migrated from many centuries, they are called Sri Lankan Tamils. But more recently, during the colonial period, a new batch of Tamils were transported by the British and they were settled over here in the central highlands of Sri Lanka, over here. You can see this yellow shaded region. This is the central highlands of Sri Lanka, which is very similar to India's Western Ghats with regard to its climate, vegetation and geography. So in the central highlands of Sri Lanka is where the British enterprises, the British colonial enterprises, they started their plantation crops. They started cultivating tea, rubber, spices. This has been the primary produce of Sri Lanka. Even today, Sri Lankan economy is heavily dependent on these commercial crops. So to run these plantations, the British, they needed cheap labor. So they transported Indian laborers, primarily Indian Tamils, in the recent past under the indentured labor system. So these Tamils who came from British India more recently, who were settled in these plantation areas in the central highlands, they are called Indian Tamils. Now after Sri Lanka gained independence from Britain in 1948, the Sinhala Buddhist majority, they always held a resentment and a grudge, especially towards Indian Tamils who had come more recently. Because the British, as a part of their divide and rule policy, they had deliberately favored Indian Tamils with regard to administrative positions. Indian Tamils had become very rich and quite influential by working in the plantations, by being in favor of the British. And this was a classic British divide and rule policy to divide communities on ethnic lines, religious lines, etc. So as Indian Tamils became more stable, they started prospering, they started becoming influential politically as well, because they got all lucrative administrative posts. This bred resentment amongst the majority community, that is the Sinhala Buddhists. So prior to independence itself, there was a social divide where the Sinhala Buddhists held resentment against Indian Tamils. Few clashes were taking place every now and then between the two communities. Immediately after independence, post 1948, the first Sri Lankan government brought out a very controversial citizenship law through which Indian Tamils were de-recognized. They were declared as stateless. They were not given citizenship by the Sinhala Buddhist dominated government. Post-independence, the Sri Lankan government was dominated by the Sinhala Buddhist majority with support from radical Buddhist factions. So as a continuation of this ethnic communal rivalry, the Sri Lankan government discriminated and even started oppressing the Tamil minorities, beginning with Indian Tamils. Their citizenship was taken away, they were de-recognized, declared as stateless, and Sri Lanka put their responsibility on India. It said Indian Tamils are India's headache. And as a result, Indian Tamils became vulnerable. Some of the radical Sinhala Buddhists, they even started targeting the Tamil community, and violence started breaking out in Sri Lanka from 1948 to 1960s. Tamil minorities would be quite frequently targeted, especially Indian Tamils. So obviously Sri Lankan Tamils also sympathized with the Indian Tamils, and as they took a stand against the policies of the Sri Lankan government, Sri Lankan Tamils also became a target. So this was pure majoritarianism. It was far right-wing extremist majoritarianism, which was backed by the government with support from the majority community, with support from radical elements. So by 1960s and 70s, we saw a systematic discrimination, targeting and oppression of Tamil minorities. Both Indian and Sri Lankan Tamils were being targeted with frequent violent incidents taking place. So eventually, some of the Tamils, the victims of the violence, they rebelled and they took up militancy in response to it. By 1970s, we saw the rise of Tamil militant outfits, which became quite notorious by 1980s, including the most prominent militant group, the LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. So by 1970s, 80s, multiple Tamil militant groups came up, seeking to fight back against the targeted violence and the oppression, and their demand was to liberate Tamil areas from Sri Lanka, to break away these areas and to form a separate independent country. So LTTE became the most prominent of these groups, and according to several reports and allegations, India also had a role to play in backing the LTTE. The then Indira Gandhi government allegedly launched a covert war against Sri Lanka, as Sri Lanka was seeming to be hostile to India during the 1971 war with Pakistan. During the Cold War period and during 1971 war, Sri Lanka was seen to be in favor of Pakistan and the US, which were hostile to India. So this led India to try and destabilize Sri Lanka as part of a geopolitical strategy, and it's been alleged that India's RAW, Research and Analysis Wing, which is India's foreign intelligence agency, was authorized by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi to meddle in Sri Lanka's internal matters and to back the Tamil militant movement to gain leverage over the Sri Lankan government. Very quickly, the violence escalated and turned into a full-fledged civil war by mid-1980s. In 1983, there were massive anti-Tamil riots led by radical Sinhala Buddhists, supported by Sri Lankan forces. This led to a cycle of counter-violence by LTTE, and by 1985, we were witnessing a brutal civil war, and a massive refugee crisis had been triggered, where thousands of Tamil refugees were fleeing towards India. So during this entire crisis, India was playing a role directly or indirectly. By 1986-87, the situation had escalated, gone beyond control, and the separatist sentiments were spreading to India's Tamil Nadu as well. So then the Rajiv Gandhi government decided to pull the plug on the support given to LTTE and decided to mediate between Sri Lanka and LTTE to work out a settlement, which is known as the Indo-Sri Lanka Peace Accord. So India mediated a settlement between the militant groups and the Sri Lankan government, and the 1987 India-Sri Lanka Peace Accord was signed. This was a historic agreement. Through this agreement, India convinced both the parties for a ceasefire to end the conflict immediately. Sri Lanka was convinced by India to pull the forces back to the barracks, and we convinced LTTE to surrender and lay down the arms and weapons. In return, we convinced Sri Lanka to implement 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which would provide for devolution of powers to provincial councils by giving them more autonomy, so that Tamil areas could become autonomous in order to protect the socio-economic rights of the Tamil population, in order to do justice to the Tamil community which had been deprived of all the benefits. So this was a settlement that India worked out. And to implement the peace accord, India also deployed Indian peacekeeping forces to ensure that the ceasefire is upheld, especially by the militant groups. But unfortunately, the peace accord failed. Both Sri Lanka and LTTE would betray India after agreeing to the terms of the agreement. After going back, LTTE refused to surrender because it believed that Sri Lanka would wipe out the groups if they lay down their arms and weapons. Also, LTTE lost faith in India as a neutral mediator. As a result, LTTE continued and escalated its violence, which was met with counter-violence by Sri Lankan forces, and in between, Indian forces were caught. It became a huge disaster for India, as hundreds of Indian soldiers were killed by LTTE, and India's involvement became highly controversial in this conflict. So in this entire process, the question about 13th Amendment always remained. 13th Amendment includes provisions of autonomy, constitutional autonomy to Tamil provinces, that is the northern and eastern provinces and other provinces as well. Essentially, the idea is to devolve powers, devolve administrative powers, legislative powers, financial powers, so that these provincial councils could enjoy more autonomy. Also, the promise was to recognize the Tamil language on par with the Sinhalese language, in order to respect the cultural rights of the Tamils. India had convinced Sri Lanka to give same recognition to the Tamil language as well. So Sri Lanka has partially implemented the 13th Amendment over the years. It has only provided for a partial implementation. See, Indo-Sri Lanka Peace Accord failed because Indian forces took the hit. The civil war continued. Eventually, IPKF had to be withdrawn, and the civil war in Sri Lanka continued for many more years. That's a different story altogether. With regard to 13th Amendment, Sri Lanka has only partially implemented the promises that were made. Even though provincial councils have been set up, provincial elections do take place, the devolution of powers is not complete. Only few limited powers have been devolved. Only few administrative powers, few financial and legislative powers have been devolved. But key subjects like land, police, taxation, they have been kept with the central government itself, with no autonomy being given to the provincial councils. That's why India keeps urging Sri Lanka to fully implement 13th Amendment even today. Even in the last 10-15 years, under Manmohan Singh government, under Modi government, whenever India interacts with the Sri Lankan leadership, Indian leaders remind Sri Lanka of the promise that was made in 1987. In order to protect the Tamil community and uphold their rights, India urges the Sri Lankan government even today to provide for a complete and full implementation of 13th Amendment. It's in this context that the Sri Lankan government has made a partial offer to devolve some additional powers to the provincial councils. But the Tamil National Alliance has rejected this because again it's a partial devolution. Key subjects like land and police are not being fully devolved to the provincial councils. Is that clear? Even though it's an old topic, it is still relevant given the crisis in Sri Lanka, the economic crisis, and India's continued support for full implementation of 13th Amendment. So that is why it can be an important topic for mains and to an extent even for your prelims. Now moving on to the next article, the third article from page 16. According to the article, the uneven distribution of monsoon rains is already affecting the sowing season, and it is likely to have an impact on Indian agriculture, which could potentially lead to food inflation in the coming months. This is a serious concern being expressed by economists, experts, and others. As you know, the distribution of this year's monsoon has been very uneven. While northern India, western India has received massive rains and they are witnessing floods, southern India and eastern India have been seeing deficient rainfall. Even according to the estimates of IMD, the Deccan Plateau and eastern regions of India, they will continue to receive lesser rainfall as compared to the long-term average. And this is going to affect the Kharif sowing season, which is critical for Indian agriculture. The month of July especially is a crucial month for sowing Kharif crops. Critical crops like paddy, pulses, especially arhar dal, they are crucial, they are a staple in the Indian diet and play a crucial role in the Indian economy. The month of July is extremely critical for the sowing season because this is when we receive the maximum rainfall. Almost 32% of monsoon precipitation occurs in this month, which is vital for Kharif sowing. But this is getting disrupted, especially in southern India, in eastern India and parts of western India, due to the uneven distribution of the monsoons. So that's the reason why serious concerns are being expressed by economists that this could affect food productivity. It could lead to a shortage in essential food items like rice, pulses, etc., which could trigger food inflation. And this volatility can spill over into headline inflation as well. It could push general inflation in the country as well in the coming months. So please note down that the sowing area has fallen in this year's monsoon season. Due to deficient rainfall, farmers have not got the right opportunity to sow the crops. So critical crops like paddy, arhar dal, the data shows that the sowed area has gone down. Now in a country like India, where agriculture is still monsoon dependent, right? Farmers are heavily dependent on monsoon rains for irrigation. Any such adverse impact due to deficient rainfall and uneven distribution of rainfall, right, could directly affect the farming season and the overall food productivity in the country. So there is past evidence as well to indicate how rainfall and inflation are linked. Deficient rainfall has a tendency to drive food inflation. Of course, there are other factors at play as well, like storage, transportation, distribution. But deficient rainfall will most likely trigger higher levels of food inflation, which could put stress on the macroeconomic indicators. There are many similar reports brought out in various journals and media outlets expressing concern about the impact of El Nino. Right? This year and the coming few seasons is likely to be impacted by the El Nino season, which refers to the abnormal warming of the Pacific waters, which directly affects the Indian monsoon. Right? El Nino is bad news for Indian monsoons. it is likely to affect the Indian monsoons in a very bad way, and it's likely to affect farming and give rise to more food inflation. So these fears are being expressed by economists. The government also has the same fears. So the government is looking at various interventions and solutions to try and boost production and increase buffer stock wherever possible in order to manage and try and maintain the inflation levels in the coming months. So it's a trend that we should watch out for. All right. Now let's head towards the prelims section. Let's take a look at the smaller articles and go through some important points for your prelims. On page number 6, we have an economy related article that refers to the exports from India, the trend and pattern of exports in the current financial year. According to the article, which is based on data from the Commerce Ministry and the other concerned ministries, Indian exports have dipped in the first quarter of this year. Especially merchandise exports, the export of Indian goods, has fallen by 15.1% in the first quarter, which is a significant drop compared to the data from previous years. Is that clear? Now this is a concern for India because, as you can see, exports from India have quite consistently declined while imports have remained stubbornly high, thereby increasing the trade deficit for India. Especially with countries like China, India has a massive trade deficit which adversely impacts the Indian economy. So exports have been declining over the last several months and imports have remained stubbornly high, and the rising trade deficit remains a concern for Indian policymakers. Under the foreign trade policy, the government has set a target of $2 trillion exports by 2030. Please make a note for your prelims. Under the latest foreign trade policy, the goal for Indian exports is $2 trillion in a financial year by 2030. The goal is to achieve $1 trillion worth of goods exports and $1 trillion worth of services exports. Because India is still a services dominated economy. Even with regard to exports, services occupies a very big share as India still struggles in manufacturing goods. So India is planning to scale up its infrastructure, boost its manufacturing capabilities to increase the export of goods, but parallelly it wants to increase the exports of services as well. So the goal set under the foreign trade policy is $1 trillion worth of exports from services, $1 trillion worth of exports from goods by 2030. Given this ambitious target, the current data is not very encouraging. The data clearly shows exports have been falling quite consistently, and especially in the first quarter of this year, there has been a 15% drop. That's why the Commerce Ministry has reached out to various export promotion councils, and it's thinking about incentives to Indian producers and exporters and traders to try and give a boost for Indian exports. The Commerce Ministry is also in touch with Indian embassies and Indian consulates abroad to try and find buyers and new markets for Indian goods and products. So the government is trying to actively intervene, but the general downtrend in the global economy, the impact of Russia-Ukraine war is definitely being seen on Indian exports as well. So observing and monitoring this trend is important because UPSC tends to ask such trend and pattern based questions in prelims, especially from Indian economy. All right. So just remember the general trend towards which Indian exports are headed. Next, we have a very, very important article on page 6 related to history. This article refers to rock art at Rudragiri, where you have rock shelters in Andhra Pradesh. It's a very interesting, very fascinating article. There are several important points you can note down from this article. Rudragiri is present in the Guntur district of Andhra Pradesh in the Eastern Ghats region. Please make a note. It's present in the Eastern Ghats and it's located at the Oravakallu Achampet Mandal in Guntur district of Andhra Pradesh. At Rudragiri, there are 5 natural rock shelters. Alright, there are 5 natural rock shelters that are present, and during the Mesolithic age, dating back to 5000 BC, Rudragiri was the site of a human habitation from the Mesolithic period. And during this ancient period, the humans who habited these rock shelters, they have carried out rock art, rock paintings. You can see one of them in the images over here. It's depicting the Vanara brothers and the battle between Vali and Sugriva. This was a rock painting which was worked upon much later in the 13th century by the Kakatiya dynasty, which ruled the region. Is that clear? So that is the uniqueness about the site. Rudragiri is a site for rock paintings and art, rock art, dating back to 5000 BC under Mesolithic period and also to 13th century under Kakatiya dynasty. In the 5 rock shelters, you find both rock paintings and rock art, some of which depicts basic animals, basic human activities dating back to the Mesolithic age, that is around 5000 BC. Along with that, you have more modern, more recent rock art carried out by artists from Kakatiya dynasty in the 13th century, where they have depicted stories and visuals from the Ramayana and other epics. For example, in one of the rock shelters, there is a rock painting depicting Lord Hanuman carrying the Sanjeevani hill with sacred symbols like the conch and the fire altar. This is apart from the rock painting depicting the fight between Vali and Sugriva. So there are similar rock paintings and rock art depicting several stories from the Ramayana and epics such as the Ramayana. There are few other rock art forms in the rock shelters where Kakatiya artists have superimposed their art over the Mesolithic art which existed from 5000 BC. Of course, these paintings, they have been exposed to the elements, to heat, sunlight, moisture, rain, water, wind. But despite all the impact of erosion and the natural elements, most of the paintings have survived. In fact, even some of the colors and pigments which have been used to bring out the vibrancy of the art, some of it has still survived. So that's why the article is highlighting the need to conserve and protect such an important historical site. It's quite rare to come across ancient and medieval rock art at the same place. So at Rudragiri you have both. You have Mesolithic rock painting from 5000 BC and also rock art dating to 13th century from the Kakatiya dynasty. So that is what you should remember about the Rudragiri site in Andhra Pradesh. Next, on page 14, we have an article related to the DP3 immunization. It's a very, very important article, especially from science and technology. I hope you guys know what is DPT. The DPT vaccine, it's a trivalent vaccine which is administered to children in multiple doses, especially children under the age of 7 years. They are administered with multiple doses of the DPT vaccine. This helps in preventing 3 deadly infectious diseases, that is diphtheria, pertussis and tetanus. All the 3 are very dangerous infectious diseases caused by different types of bacteria. Is that clear? Diphtheria is a condition where there is a very high fatality rate as it leads to the formation of a membrane that covers the tonsils and the upper part of the respiratory system, making it very difficult for young children and infants to breathe. So due to collapse of the respiratory system, children tend to die, thus highlighting the seriousness of this disease, which is spread by a dangerous bacteria. Pertussis is another condition, another bacterial disease, also called as whooping cough. It induces very intense coughing, and even this could be fatal for young children, especially in developing small countries, underdeveloped countries. Such diseases, infectious bacterial diseases, are widely prevalent. Tetanus is another infectious bacterial disease, also called the lockjaw disease, because tetanus infection affects the central nervous system and could cripple our motor abilities. It could cripple our ability to move our hands, legs, even the mouth, even the jaw. So it's called the lockjaw disease. It can affect muscle contractions and it could easily turn fatal as well. So to prevent these dangerous bacterial infections, we have a common vaccine, the DPT vaccine, that targets diphtheria, pertussis and tetanus. So given the fatality rate, given the impact of these diseases on young children, it's very, very important to enhance the coverage of the vaccine. The World Health Organization has been pushing for it. India also has actively rolled out the DPT vaccine through the Universal Immunization Program. And according to the WHO, there is a very positive development for India. According to the WHO report, India has achieved a 93% coverage of DPT-3 vaccine after the COVID-19 pandemic. Is that clear? The previous high, the previous record was a coverage of around 91% in 2019. That was before the pandemic. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted vaccination programs. But now, India has scaled up the vaccination drive again. Along with measles vaccine, India has effectively rolled out the DPT vaccine as well, particularly the third dose, which is very crucial. And it has achieved a 93% coverage. So this is a phenomenal record. This will really help India to fight these diseases. They can be prevented entirely. Also, the WHO report is pointing out that India has reduced the number of zero doses that children have received with regard to DPT vaccine. That is, children who are not covered with the vaccine at all. India had 4.6 million children under this category who are not covered through DPT vaccine at all. They wouldn't have received even a single dose. This number has been reduced by 50% to 2.3 million. That's a very big achievement for India. And we've also managed to reduce the doses that are getting missed, at least administering the first 3 doses. This coverage has been increased and we have reduced the number of people being left out, the number of children being left out from the coverage. So through the right strategies and interventions, India has increased the coverage of DPT immunization, and this is a big achievement for India. So noting this fact and understanding what is DPT is very, very important for your prelims. Next, on the same page, we have another development reported with regard to the Vande Bharat trains. As you know, Vande Bharat trains, they have been a flagship initiative of the Modi government. They are semi-high-speed trains with better facilities and amenities and better coaches to improve passenger experience and also to reduce the travel time. So India had struck a deal with Russia. Indian public sector unit, Rail Vikas Nigam Limited, had earlier struck a deal with few Russian rail and locomotive manufacturers such as Metro Wagon Mash to play a role in producing 120 Vande Bharat train sets. But this important deal had been struck. It had been stuck because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It had led to delays in the project. Now the deal is back on track. That's what the article is mentioning. So I just want you guys to know that Russia is also playing a role in rolling out the Vande Bharat trains in India. Russian locomotive companies are working with Indian public sector units under the Indian Railways to roll out the Vande Bharat express trains. Alright, so just a small fact to note from international relations. Next, the last article for today, it's related to the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Right, DRC is an African country which has been hit by a devastating civil war from many, many years. But DRC is a very huge country located in Central Africa, and it is blessed with natural resources. It's blessed with precious minerals, rare earth elements, and even with very precious forest resources. The UAE has signed a deal with the DRC for a mining contract. It's a $1.9 billion project. It's a follow-up to an earlier mining project that was signed by the United Arab Emirates. See, Congo is known for artisanally mined ores, such as cobalt. Is that clear? I hope you guys know that cobalt is a critical mineral. It's extremely important for lithium-ion batteries, which is a key component in all electronic devices, gadgets, etc. So DRC, which is this North African or Central African country that you see here in the map, right? It's surrounded by all these countries here: Zambia, Malawi, Angola, the Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania as well. All these are the neighbors of the DRC. This large Central African country is blessed with immense resources, all right, including cobalt and many other precious minerals. But unfortunately, it's been a very unstable, volatile country because of the ongoing conflict and civil war. There are multiple rebel groups, militias, and radical terrorist organizations which are operating in the DRC in different parts of the region, especially in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. That is towards the borders with Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi. In Eastern DRC is where the conflict and the civil war is very, very intense. Even UN peacekeeping forces are deployed over here, and you also have Indian soldiers deployed here in Eastern DRC as part of the UN peacekeeping mission. Recently, few Indian soldiers have lost their lives as well in DRC because of the ongoing conflict. So in Eastern DRC, the country is blessed with forest resources. You can see the forest cover in Eastern DRC, and across the country, it is very well blessed with precious minerals and resources, from diamond, gold to cobalt, lead, tin, zinc, and even hydrocarbon reserves, coal, oil, and even uranium. So DRC is truly blessed with energy resources and precious minerals and metals, thus making DRC a focus country for several countries. But the problem is that since the country is largely devastated by civil war, there is an exploitation of these resources. Outside powers are too eager to get their hands on these resources by colluding either with rebel groups or with the temporary governments that exist. They strike these corrupt deals with them. And the problem here is that these mines, they involve child labor, they involve slavery, and they involve environmental destruction. For example, the Russian private mercenary group, Wagner Group, reportedly has a contract to operate in DRC, target few rebels, and in return get control of forest and mineral resources. Similarly, there are many foreign companies, Western companies as well, and companies belonging to West Asian countries, which are very eager to exploit the resources, even at the cost of human rights and environmental damage. Just last year, there was a report that DRC has auctioned forest areas in this equatorial tropical forest region, and it has auctioned off these forest areas for mining projects which could lead to large-scale deforestation. This is what led UPSC to ask a question related to DRC in the prelims, right? So you should just have some basic awareness about this. Cobalt mining is very, very lucrative in the DRC, but cobalt mining involves a lot of manual work where human labor is exploited, slavery is witnessed, child labor is very common. There are child soldiers as well in the DRC where children are given arms and weapons as part of the ongoing civil war. So there are ethical concerns, there are serious concerns with regard to human rights and environmental protection as well. That is why any such mining project in the DRC is very, very controversial. All right. So just some of these basic facts could help you answer a possible question in prelims. So this completes my detailed discussion for today. I hope you guys have understood all the topics. Please go through the questions, use them for your mains answer writing practice, post the answers in the answer writing portal. Then don't forget, head to our Telegram channel. We have a quiz on these topics so you can revise these articles again. And if you liked the initiative, do support us by pressing that like button, share it, share your feedback in the comments. I'll go through them, and also subscribe to the channel. So that is it from my side. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. Till then, take care. Have a good day.